Have you ever loved someone so deeply that your heart started to dim? Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally realized they'd never meet you halfway. And then, the moment you stopped chasing, that's when they finally notice what they lost. You see, the super empath has this incredible power, the ability to love through someone's silence, to see potential through pain, and to give when they have nothing left to give. But there comes a moment when even the warmest heart gets tired of being misunderstood, when the empath, who once explained, forgave, and functioned, finally goes quiet. That silence isn't cruelty, it's clarity. The avoidant, who's built walls to feel safe, suddenly realizes that the person who kept knocking at those walls isn't there anymore. And for the first time, the silence feels heavier than the connection ever did. Because when the super empath goes emotionally cold, they don't do it to punish, they do it to protect. They've learned that love without respect drains the soul. And the avoidant, who thought distance meant control, finally feels the weight of absence. Here's the truth. People don't change when you keep saving them. They change when your absence teaches them what your presence was worth. So if you're the empath, I want you to know this. Your silence isn't weakness. It's a boundary. It's the moment your healing begins and their denial ends. Because when your heart finally stops reaching, the universe whispers, "Feno." It's time they do the work. When someone deeply empathetic goes emotionally cold, it's rarely a sudden switch. It's the quiet result of countless moments when they tried to explain how they felt, only to be dismissed, ignored, or made to feel like they were too sensitive. The empath doesn't shut down overnight. They reach that place slowly, after realizing that no amount of warmth, patience, or understanding can melt a heart that's committed to staying distant. When they finally go cold, it isn't a performance, it's preservation. The empath has always been the one who leans in. They're the ones who notice when something feels off, when the energy in the room changes, when the tone shifts just slightly. They're attuned to emotion in a way that makes them natural healers, but also easy targets for people who aren't ready to meet them emotionally. The avoidant personality often finds comfort in the empath's care, even as they resist it. They want connection, but not closeness. They crave love, but on their terms. And so they pull away, test boundaries, or stay vague just long enough to keep control. The empath feels this push and pull deeply. It creates an emotional confusion that makes them question themselves. For a while, they try harder. They soften their words, they shrink their needs, they give more space. But every time they reach out and meet a wall, something inside them starts to dim. What's really happening in those moments is not anger, it's grief. The empath is mourning the version of the relationship they believed in. They're mourning the hope that if they just loved a little more, the other person would finally feel safe enough to open up. When that doesn't happen, the empath starts to shift. The emotional coldness that follows isn't a lack of care. It's the natural result of care that has nowhere to land. It's like speaking into a room where no one answers back. Eventually, you stop speaking. The empath's warmth, once endless, begins to focus inward. They no longer explain what should already be understood. They stop chasing apologies that never come. They no longer fight for the connection because they've realized it shouldn't be a fight in the first place. To the avoidant, this shift can feel sudden and confusing. They may interpret it as rejection or punishment, but what they're really witnessing is the empath choosing peace over pursuit. The silence isn't meant to hurt. It's meant to heal for the first time. The empath isn't prioritizing the relationship over themselves. They've learned that constantly rescuing someone who resists closeness only keeps them stuck in a cycle of emotional scarcity. In that coldness, there's actually strength. It's the kind of strength that comes from exhaustion, from the deep knowing that love shouldn't feel like begging for crumbs. When the empath goes emotionally cold, it's their heart's way of saying, "I've done enough." It's the clearest, most powerful form of communication they'll ever use, not through words, but through silence that says, I choose myself now. The avoidant type often lives in emotional self-protection. They fear vulnerability because to them, intimacy feels like exposure, and exposure feels unsafe. So they learn to keep distance, to manage closeness in small, controlled doses. They believe that by staying detached, they can't be hurt. But what they don't realize is that in protecting themselves from pain, they also block themselves from genuine connection. When they meet a super empath, someone capable of emotional depth and understanding, it feels both comforting and terrifying. The empath represents everything they crave: warmth, consistency, love that doesn't need to be earned, but it also threatens the avoidant's illusion of control. In the beginning, the avoidant is drawn to the empath's energy. They feel seen in ways they're not used to. The empath's acceptance feels safe, even healing. But the closer things get, the more their defenses rise. The avoidant begins to pull away, creating space they think they need to breathe. To them, distance is safety. To the empath, distance feels like rejection. So the empath compensates, reaching out more, explaining more, giving more reassurance. The avoidant becomes overwhelmed by the intensity, confirming their fear that closeness equals suffocation. They retreat further, and so begins a cycle where one chases and one withdraws. For a long time, the avoidant doesn't notice how much the empath has been holding the emotional weight of the relationship. They assume the empath will always be there, always forgiving, always understanding. It becomes easy to take that warmth for granted because it has never been withheld. But when the empath finally steps back, when they stop trying to bridge the gap, the avoidant encounters something unfamiliar. Silence. That silence is not just the absence of words, it's the absence of emotional safety, of the constant reassurance they didn't realize they depended on. It's in that stillness that the avoidant begins to feel the void they've created. The very space they once craved now feels empty. The emotional security they thought was guaranteed suddenly vanishes. And in that emptiness, they begin to understand something that was invisible to them before. That love doesn't wait forever. For the first time, they're forced to face their own emotional patterns without the buffer of someone constantly soothing them. The empath's absence becomes a mirror. It reflects back the consequences of avoidance, the loneliness behind the illusion of control. What once felt like power now feels like loss. They replay conversations, remember the warmth they pushed away, and realize that what they interpreted as pressure was actually care. The silence exposes the truth they've been running from. Connection requires participation. Love cannot thrive when one person keeps closing the door. This is often the moment of reckoning for the avoidant. They feel the weight of what they've lost, not because the empath withdrew to hurt them, but because that withdrawal revealed how much they had relied on the empath's emotional labor. When presence is gone, absence becomes unbearable. The avoidant finally understands the space they once fought for has become the very thing that breaks them. Boundaries are not walls. They are expressions of self-respect. They tell others how to love you, how to treat you, and where your limits lie. For the super empath, boundaries can be one of the hardest things to establish because their instinct is to give. They measure love through understanding, effort, and sacrifice. They believe that if they are kind enough, patient enough, and open enough, the other person will eventually meet them there. But love without boundaries quickly turns into imbalance. It becomes a one-sided effort where the empath gives endlessly while the avoidant stays comfortably detached. At first, the empath may not even realize they're neglecting themselves. They confuse being kind with being available at all times. They think being patient means accepting repeated neglect or emotional distance. They interpret love as endurance, a test of how much they can tolerate. But slowly, the exhaustion begins to show. They start to feel unseen, undervalued, and emotionally depleted. The more they give, the less they receive, and the more the dynamic reinforces itself. The avoidant learns that they don't have to stretch. The empath will stretch for both of them. Boundaries change that. They are the moment the empath's energy begins to shift inward. Instead of chasing connection, they begin to protect their peace. Instead of over-explaining, they start allowing silence to speak. Setting a boundary isn't about punishing the avoidant. It's about reclaiming balance. It says, I am willing to love you, but not at the cost of losing myself. For the empath, that realization is powerful. It's the recognition that love should add to you, not drain you. When boundaries enter the relationship, they expose the truth of it. If the connection was built on dependency or emotional imbalance, boundaries will make that visible. The avoidant who once relied on the empath's endless availability suddenly finds that access limited. They may react with confusion, frustration, or even withdrawal. But that discomfort is necessary. It forces both people to confront their patterns, the empath's tendency to overgive, and the avoidant's habit of holding back. Real growth begins when both learn to sit in that discomfort without running from it. Boundaries also redefine the empath's idea of love. They begin to understand that saying no is not rejection. It's self-preservation, that stepping back doesn't mean they've stopped caring. It means they're no longer willing to care at their own expense. Through boundaries, the empath begins to value emotional reciprocity. Love that feels mutual, not one-sided. They stop confusing effort with worth and start recognizing that their presence is a gift, not a guarantee. For the avoidant, those boundaries are often the first time they feel the reality of consequences. They can no longer depend on the empath's endless patience. They must either step forward or lose the connection. Boundaries become the silent teacher, showing both individuals that healthy love thrives not in freedom without accountability, but in closeness with respect. There comes a moment when even the most compassionate heart realizes that healing cannot happen in the same space where pain keeps repeating. For the super empath, this is one of the hardest truths to accept. They are built to fix, to understand, to hold space for others. They believe that with enough empathy, they can soften the walls of someone who fears closeness. But over time, they begin to notice that their efforts only circle back to the same emotional distance. The avoidant partner withdraws, the empath reaches, and the cycle continues. Every time the empath tries to repair the connection, they end up reopening the same wound within themselves. Healing requires safety, and safety can't exist where a person feels consistently dismissed or unseen. The empath eventually realizes that love alone cannot transform an environment that doesn't nurture them. It's not that they stop loving. It's that they learn love isn't supposed to hurt this much. Emotional distance becomes their medicine, not because they want to detach forever, but because they need space to remember who they are outside of the cycle of chasing and disappointment. When the empath steps away, it's not a cold act. It's a return to clarity. They start to see the relationship for what it truly is, rather than what they hoped it could be. In that quiet separation, they begin to understand how much of themselves they lost trying to hold on to someone who was never fully present. They recognize how many times they silenced their intuition just to keep the peace. Distance allows them to breathe again, to reconnect with their own emotional rhythm. This period of withdrawal can feel painful, even lonely, but it's necessary. Healing doesn't happen in constant proximity to the trigger. It happens in the stillness that follows. The empath begins to rebuild boundaries that had eroded over time. They relearn that their emotions are valid, that their needs are not too much, and that being deeply feeling is not a weakness. They start nurturing the parts of themselves that were neglected, the hobbies, dreams, and inner peace that faded while they were busy trying to hold everything together. Meanwhile, the avoidant often faces the consequence of their emotional habits during this separation. They feel the emptiness that follows the empath's absence and begin to see what the relationship truly cost them. The silence they once sought for comfort becomes a mirror reflecting their fear of intimacy. Without the empath's constant presence to absorb their avoidance, they are left with themselves, and that confrontation can be deeply unsettling. For the empath, this distance is not just about walking away, it's about choosing a new kind of healing, one rooted in self-awareness rather than self-sacrifice. They learn that peace isn't found in fixing someone else, but in refusing to abandon themselves. Again, emotional distance becomes a sanctuary, a space where their heart can finally rest and their spirit can begin to feel whole again. When the super empath finally stops chasing, everything in the dynamic shifts. The entire rhythm of the relationship changes, because for so long, it was sustained by their effort, their reaching, their willingness to keep the emotional current alive. The empath's love had always been the heartbeat of the connection, the consistent force that tried to close the gap created by the avoidance distance. But when that energy withdraws, the balance of power is no longer the same. The avoidant, who once felt safe behind walls of detachment, is suddenly faced with silence that feels like an echo of everything they never said. The empath's decision to stop chasing isn't impulsive. It's born from exhaustion, from a deep inner realization that love cannot thrive when it's one-sided. They've spent countless moments hoping the avoidant would meet them halfway, only to find themselves standing alone. When the empath pulls back, it's not a tactic or manipulation, it's surrender, not to the loss, but to the truth. They are no longer willing to pour energy into a connection that refuses to flow both ways. That quiet withdrawal sends a message more powerful than any confrontation ever could. For the avoidant, this shift feels disorienting. The predictability of the dynamic is gone. They were used to being pursued, to knowing the empath's love would always be there no matter how far they pulled away. The absence of that pursuit forces them to face emotions they've spent years avoiding: guilt, regret, fear, and the unsettling awareness of how much they relied on the empath's steadiness. They begin to realize that what they mistook for control was actually avoidance, and what they thought was freedom now feels like emptiness. The silence that follows becomes the avoidant's teacher. It reveals the emotional safety they once had, but never appreciated. They start to feel the weight of missed moments, the unspoken words, and the affection they kept at a distance. In many cases, this is when the avoidant's defenses begin to crumble. Without the chase, they can finally see the empath not as a pursuer, but as a person with limits, needs, and dignity. Sometimes that's the exact wake-up call they need to begin their own growth, to confront their fears of intimacy and vulnerability. For the empath, this period of not chasing becomes an act of healing and empowerment. They learn that stepping back doesn't mean they've given up on love. It means they've stopped abandoning themselves for it. The energy they once spent trying to be understood now turns inward, nurturing their self-worth. They find peace in not needing to be chosen by someone who couldn't see their value before. And in that peace, they begin to attract relationships built on balance rather than effort. When the empath stops chasing, it doesn't mark the end of love. It marks the beginning of self-respect. The avoidant may finally break down under the weight of what they've lost, but for the empath, that moment is not about victory. It's about freedom. It's the moment they realize they were never meant to beg for connection. Love was never supposed to be a chase. It was always meant to be a meeting point. When the super empath finally steps back, everything becomes clear. Not just to the avoidant, but to both of them. The empath realizes that love isn't about how much they can give. It's about whether it's received with the same heart. They understand that peace will never grow where confusion lives, and that their softness is a strength, not a weakness. The avoidant, in turn, begins to see the cost of their distance, that love cannot survive in half light, and that connection only deepens when both people are brave enough to show up fully. The beauty of this moment is that it isn't about punishment or revenge. It's about transformation. The empath learns to direct their compassion inward, to nurture their own healing instead of constantly patching someone else's wounds. And the avoidant, often for the first time, feels the gravity of their emotional absence. They finally understand that connection requires participation, and that silence, once their shield, can also be their greatest loss. When the empath goes emotionally cold, it isn't the end of love, it's the rebirth of self. It's the moment they stop shrinking to be understood and start standing tall in their truth. Because real love doesn't chase, it meets. It doesn't beg, it invites. It doesn't drain, it nourishes. And when both people are ready, truly ready, love doesn't feel like survival, it feels like home. So to the super empaths who've carried more than their share, your silence speaks volumes, your stillness is strength, and your peace is your power. Never doubt that the moment you choose yourself, everything begins to shift, not out of loss, but out of alignment with the love you've always deserved. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for showing up with your heart open. May you find the kind of love that doesn't ask you to dim your light, but celebrates it. And remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can ever do is stop trying to be understood by those who refuse to see you. Take care of your heart, honor your boundaries, and keep choosing peace again and again. Thank you.